Hey, welcome back, everyone. Well, big news and something that I think we talked about before. All gun control in the United States may soon come to an end. And this has to do with the recent Supreme Court ruling looking into some of this, which laid out a new interpretation on how gun control laws should be interpreted, which is they have to be seen within the context of the American kind of founding documents. And if you go back to the founding of the United States, it was a right to bear arms and form a militia, and that shall not be infringed. There were no limits. And of course, government has created many, many, many limits. And based on this new guidance on gun control, there are groups suing their governments across the United States, suing local governments across the United States to overturn and challenge some of the existing gun laws. The media, well, the legacy news out there, they're freaking out right now. They're freaking out. And they're saying pretty directly that pretty much every gun control law right now, every single one of them, is at risk of being overturned. Also, folks, something interesting is happening. Of course, maybe some of you will not be surprised by this, but El Chapo, the jailed Mexican cartel leader, said something very interesting recently from his jail cell, which is that the drug trade will never end unless, of course, you go after corrupt government officials in both the United States and in Mexico. Because he's saying that there are government officials in on the take, basically, and that corruption on both sides of the border is what's allowing this trade to take place. Now, I think most of you maybe kind of knew this, or maybe some of you did, because, of course, we know about things like, well, Fast and Furious. We know about how Obama was opening up the drug trade with Hezbollah. Folks, I'll be talking about this today. It's going to be a great episode. That said, those of you who are on YouTube or Rumble, we will jump over at EpochTV exclusively after about 25 minutes, so come join us there. Also, big announcement. We're launching a new show. I'll be one of the rotating hosts. We're doing a primetime show. That's going to be, at least for now, the goal is to have it daily. But for now, 7 p.m. Eastern Time every Wednesday. 7 p.m. Eastern Time every Wednesday. It's a co-production between Epoch Times and NTD Television, which is our sister media. I'm pretty sure it'll be on Epoch TV, but I'll confirm with that. The show is going to be called Newsmakers. The first episode we filmed now is me and Tiffany Meyer from China in Focus. And so, folks, check it out. That's going to be tonight, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. The show is again called Newsmakers. All right, folks, that said, let's jump into the first story. I want to talk about how, well, gun control laws are out the window. And the legacy news outlets are freaking out about it. I'll start with CNN. CNN is saying how the Supreme Court put gun control laws in jeopardy nationwide. And they're saying it did not take long for top gun rights activists to realize that the Second Amendment ruling handed down by the Supreme Court in June was going to transform the legal fight over access to firearms. And it says, in the 3 months since the 6-3 decision in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association, Inc. versus Bruen, that was the big one, right? Scores of new lawsuits have been filed against gun restrictions at the federal, state, and local levels. Though the Supreme Court case concerned a type of gun permitting regime embraced by just a handful of states, the conservative majority used the Bruen decision to provide new instructions for how courts are to assess the constitutionality of gun laws nationwide. The decision was the first major Supreme Court guns ruling in more than a decade, and it came after Justice Clarence Thomas, who authored the majority opinion, had previously complained that the High Court had allowed the Second Amendment to be treated as a disfavored right. Since the June ruling, federal judges in at least half a dozen different cases have already cited the Bruen decision to rule against gun restrictions that have included local assault weapons bans, prohibitions on the manufacture of homemade firearms, and bans on older teenagers publicly carrying handguns. Of course, folks, if you go by the Constitution, it shall not be infringed. If you go by the Constitution, the rights to bear arms are pretty dang broad. It's there's really no serious limits in the Constitution to your rights to bear arms. Now, one of the big arguments with the Constitution is that Democrats they believe that the Constitution is a living document. It's a fancy way of saying they can change it however they want. Right? It's a living document, so they can alter the interpretation of it. Conservatives tend to believe that the Constitution should be interpreted as it was written. And what Clarence Thomas did with his gun control ruling, again, the V. Bruen case, right? What he did with his ruling was made it when he wrote his clarification. He basically stated that gun control laws should be interpreted based on they have to be interpreted in context of historical documents, essentially, meaning that you would have to interpret it based on the laws at the time of the founding fathers and how they wrote it. At the time of the founding fathers, the idea of gun control and gun laws was basically that guns were for fighting wars. Every American citizen should own a gun to potentially fight in a militia, to fight against foreign governments, war-level weaponry. And also something very interesting as well, which is, one of the arguments when it comes to gun laws in general as well is that, they were talking about muskets. Those were black powder rifles. Those were not assault weapons. Those were not semi-automatic handguns. Well, look, Lewis and Clark had a semi-automatic repeating rifle. It was an air gun, actually. They did have these things back then. But if you understand the nature of that argument, does that mean that your First Amendment rights, your rights to free speech, don't apply to modern times because, the founding fathers didn't have the internet? Does that mean that your protections on free speech don't include phones because the founding fathers did not have phones? Does that mean that illegal searches and seizures should not apply to your digital assets, should not apply to surveillance of your home, should not apply to any kind of government overreach that involves any form of modern technology because the founding fathers did not have modern technology? The nature of that interpretation is, I think, very dangerous because it's suggesting that changes in technology override your basic protections as, frankly, just a human being. That any right of yours could be violated if it uses technology that did not exist in the time of the founding fathers. That's the danger of that type of interpretation of the Constitution. The belief that if something did not exist at that time, then new developments in technology automatically override the constitutional rights that were written. Should people, for example, be thrown back in shackles and slavery if, for example, the new technology comes out that can enslave people? If a new gun comes out that changes the technology, should that gun then not be interpreted in context of the way the Constitution was written? That's the nature of that type of argument. And frankly, again, if the interpretation were otherwise, if it was determined that advances in technology automatically override constitutional protections, even though most people would interpret that, at least in the initial stage, as being about firearms and so on, black powder rifles and so on, if you want to interpret it like that, then that's a concerning development because that would mean that any kind of new development then. And it could be interpreted in a way that could override every other part of the Constitution. And so Justice Clarence Thomas, his clarification on his ruling, which basically brought things back to the origin, brought things back to the beginning, saying this is how you interpret it. The Constitution says this. You need to interpret the Constitution based on history. And that's how you interpret it, not based on modern developments. That's what he did, and the nature of that could now overturn every single gun law that's written in the entire United States. Huge development. That being said, I wouldn't mind owning a cannon or, the 50 caliber bore, black powder rifle. At the same time, too, interesting note, you actually can't fire those old guns with your eyes open. You have to close your eyes when you aim because the powder blows back in your face. Not exactly the safest type of home defense weapon, but anyways, beside the point. Folks, I want to go deeper into this because I want to talk about what's happening a bit more with these gun control laws and how this new law is being interpreted and what it means for the United States. Before I go further into this, though, folks, we do have a sponsor today. Today's episode is brought to you by American Hartford Gold. Now, we'd like to take a moment to thank American Hartford Gold, again, helping the show keep going. And as we've been talking about, inflation is going to continue and likely going to get a whole lot worse. Even Fed Chair Powell is warning us to brace ourselves, even suggesting there's going to be mass unemployment the way things are going. Well, there's one way to hedge against inflation, folks, and that's American Hartford Gold, which makes it simple and easy to diversify your savings and retirement accounts with physical gold and silver. You hold it in your hand. I can't take it away from you, technically, right? With one short phone call, they can have physical gold and silver delivered right to your door or into your IRA or 401k. American Hartford Gold is one of the highest rated firms in the country with an A-plus rating from the BBB and thousands of satisfied clients. If you call them right now, they'll give you up to $2,500 of free silver and a free safe on all qualifying orders. So don't wait. Call them now. That's 877-260-2764, 877-260-2764, or text Joshua to 65532. One more time, that's 877-260-2764, or text Joshua to 65532. And big thanks out again to American Hartford Gold for sponsoring today's episode. All right, folks, further into this, let's talk about what this means, this new gun control law, well, the clarification from Clarence Thomas and what that means for gun control laws across America. Well, Breitbart had something interesting. They did a follow-up piece on the CNN article noting that CNN sounds alarm SCOTUS, as in the Supreme Court, may wipe out gun control nationwide. And it says CNN sounded the alarm Sunday, warning that the pro-Second Amendment makeup of the Supreme Court of the United States, or SCOTUS, portends to end gun control nationwide. CNN's Tierney Sneed pointed to the June 23, 2022 SCOTUS decision, which was NYSRPA v. Bruen, noting that it not only struck down the New York proper case requirement, but also set forward stringent rules for how lower courts must decide cases related to the Second Amendment. On July 1st, Breitbart News noted that SCOTUS remanded a number of cases, vacating the decision and ordering them to be reconsidered in light of Bruen. In other words, cases that were already going through, cases that looked like probably the people trying to fight for the rights to bear arms were probably going to lose. The Supreme Court made the courts basically redo these in light of the new ruling. Meaning a lot of the gun control laws that were challenged and pretty much people lost, a lot of these cases have to be heard again. A lot of these cases need to stand trial again. And as a lot of these cases that were previously brought forward are again brought to light under this new interpretation, that means that these cases are going to change the laws on your right to bear arms. Very likely significantly opening it up to make it more easy for you to bear arms. Now, if you understand that the right to bear arms as won by the Constitution shall not be infringed, government regulations that would infringe it, even including potentially, gun registration laws and so on, could easily be deemed unconstitutional. This is why CNN is really freaking out over it so much. If you understand that any kind of government intervention, any kind of state intervention in people's ability to buy and own and even possibly sell firearms, any kind of intervention in that would be essentially the government infringing upon the right, as written in the Constitution, to bear those weapons. Meaning, again, all of them could be wiped out. This could be the end of gun control. Now, it says roughly 2 weeks later, Breitbart News, back when they had the ruling, pointed to a Washington Times article suggesting the Bruen decision puts all types of gun control in the crosshairs of gun rights groups. The New York Times paraphrased Justice Clarence Thomas's emphasis on the important decision like Bruen, McDonald v. Chicago, District of Columbia v. Heller, 2008, saying, quote, the test that courts must apply is whether a firearms restriction would have seemed responsible to the founding generation that crafted and ratified the Second Amendment. If not, the law must give way to the Constitution. Keep in mind, folks, a lot of people say, of course, that, The founding fathers, again, they were talking about muskets, they were talking about old weapons, and they're saying that, you don't need a 50 caliber rifle to shoot a deer. I think that was something that, in New York was one of the big arguments. They're not about shooting deer, folks. Let's put it that way. The founding fathers made it clear that the purpose of the right to bear arms is to defend the rights of the citizenry against the potential risk of tyranny from foreign powers or from your own government. The nature of the right to bear arms is the last threshold to defend the freedom that Americans are given against any kind of tyranny. This is not about shooting deer. It's about shooting tyrants. And that was the way it was written. And in context of the fact that the founding fathers were literally a large group of insurrectionists who fought against the largest, most powerful army in the world and won, incredible stories, some of which are not properly told. Some of the individuals who fought in the American Revolutionary War in the dead of winter had no shoes, walking on snow and ice. Many of them had no ammo in their guns. They were fighting with essentially just empty rifles, just being there alongside their fellow countrymen, standing up against the Brits. Right? Really incredible stories. That was the context of the writing of the Constitution. That was the context of them writing about the right to bear arms, not about your right to shoot a deer or a rabbit or something like that. And there was no clarification on the advancement of weaponry, whether, for example, new technologies emerging would change the nature of it. Again, the types of weapons they had at that time were war weapons. Those were the weapons you would use in a standing military, and that was the nature of the context in which they wrote this. And again, given that, we'll see how wide the door gets flung open with this. It's going to be very interesting in terms of how broadly this could be interpreted, but essentially that's what it is. There were even arguments on owning heavy artillery. Not even joking. One of the famous flags in Texas is the "Come and Take It" flag, which is a picture of a cannon. Because when the Texans, remember, Texans used to be part of Mexico, right? It was the Texicans, they called them. When the Mexican government, after, of course, there was a revolution in Mexico which overthrew the Spanish rule, Texans had an agreement with the Spanish government to be able to, go to Texas, into the land there, because there was a lot of empty land, build their homes, build their communities, and essentially just, live there and bring value to the land. Back in that time when there wasn't social welfare or other things like that, people tended to bring value when they settled in an area. They were not like, leeching off the government, essentially, or leeching off their fellow countrymen. If they went to an area and were able to live and sustain themselves, they created communities, they created towns, they created economies, and they created value on the land. The Spanish government saw that as a big benefit. They let the Texans, the Texicans, a lot of Americans who went to Texas, basically go there and just build it. The new Mexican government, after, again, having their own revolution to overthrow the Spanish government, refused to acknowledge the agreement the Texicans had with the Spanish government. And that launched, of course, a civil war. The Mexican, tyrant Santa Anna, after having overthrown the legitimate government at that time, of course, was seen as someone trying to overturn the rights of the Texans, and they tried taking the cannon away from the Texans. And the Texans drew a picture of that cannon on a flag and hung it up over their buildings and said, "Come and take it," meaning you come and take our heavy artillery, we'll blow your brains out. That's what the Texans did, right? Again, one of the big arguments around gun control. Now, I'm not personally, I'm a bit wary on people owning heavy artillery, but that was the nature of it at that time. Anyways, folks, yeah, actually, I have a T-shirt of that flag still. All right, further in on this, because I'm going deeper into it. Zero Hedge had something interesting, because already we see this happening. Already now we see some examples of this, again, the V. Bruen case, how it's being interpreted. One of the big ones being around ghost guns, or guns that do not have their serial numbers. This is actually significant on a few really important points, actually. I'd say very significant, because this ties into the idea of whether the government can regulate firearms in general. The nature of ghost guns, those who are not familiar with it, you can create zip guns. They're honestly easy to make. You can have what they call pipe guns. Something as simple as a mousetrap that hits a shotgun shell could be considered a gun. On that note, if you want to get rich on gun buyback programs, you can get a mousetrap and pull the thing back and drill a little hole in it and stick a shotgun shell in it and call it a ghost gun, and you can sell them for about $100 a piece to the government. Right? I'm half joking. Don't do that. The point is, though, it's very easy to make ghost guns or pipe guns, and the government is trying to regulate that right now. One of the big concerns that they've expressed is this idea that people can 3D print their own firearms. There are, of course, plans you can download online if you have a 3D printer, and you can print a gun. You can also print lowers, which is the part of the firearm that's kind of one of the core pieces of it, and you can just buy pieces and basically build your own gun. It's very easy to do. The government being concerned that they cannot regulate these guns, which is why they call them ghost guns. They're ghosts to the system. They cannot track them. They don't know who owns them. There's no serial numbers. The Biden administration and the Democrats have been going very strongly against this. They've really been trying to stop these things. And one of the latest cases on this just overturned that. And I think that it was easy to miss this, frankly, because there's so much crazy stuff going on right now. There's crazy stuff going on right now. And so I think this kind of, was easily missed. But the significance of this is really, really broad. Because this is not just about ghost guns. This is about whether the government can legally track and regulate firearms. Let me explain. Zero Hedge had this story that says judge throws out Fed law against guns with serial numbers removed. It says, in a move that already has gun control enthusiasts clutching their pearls, a judge on Wednesday ruled that a federal law barring possession of a gun with a removed serial number is unconstitutional. In other words, if you have a gun this is even beyond ghost guns. This is if you have a legitimate gun and someone files off the serial number, you can still legally own it. That was a big challenge there. And, right now, this whole thing has essentially been overturned. It says, taking his cue from the guiding precedent of the Supreme Court's landmark June gun ruling that found Americans have a constitutionally protected right to carry a handgun in public, U.S. District Judge Joseph Goodwin said the serial number removal law was inconsistent with the country's historical tradition of firearms regulation. That's the Bruen ruling there. Again, the foundation of this new ruling against ghost guns, or that allows you to have ghost guns and allows you to even have guns with serial numbers scrubbed off them, was based on an interpretation with the foundation of the V. Bruen case. And again, that the law has to be consistent with the country's, quote, historical tradition of firearms regulation. And that's kind of a joke, folks, because the historical tradition of firearms regulation, there were no firearms regulations. They did not exist. That's the historical interpretation of it. So if government has to go by the historical tradition of firearm regulation, there was none. Right? And again, based on that, they've made it so you can now own ghost guns. At least, they probably still try to challenge you on it. And you can own guns with the serial number scrubbed off them. It says Wednesday's ruling in U.S. v. Prince sprang from a criminal case in which a man named Randy Prince was charged with possessing a firearm with its serial number removed. The law that was struck down made it a crime to either transport such a gun across state lines or simply possess such a gun if it had ever crossed a state line. Yeah, big deal, right? All right, folks, I want to talk about also, speaking of gun trafficking, does anyone remember Fast and Furious when the Obama administration was selling firearms to the Mexican drug cartels? Well, interesting, something big on this. El Chapo in Mexico is calling out the U.S. government and corruption in the U.S. government as basically being one of the foundations of the cartel operations. Pretty dang significant, folks. I'm going to jump over to EpochTV exclusively for this one, though. We'll go into a few other things today. I'm going to talk about El Chapo and his, frankly, exposing corrupt officials in the United States as being a core piece of the Mexican drug cartels and their operations. How that ties into Obama trafficking drugs to Hezbollah, how that ties into Obama allowing for the trafficking of firearms, killing people in Mexico and on the U.S. side of the border, and how that all got swept under the big rug of government action. We're going to go into this in a minute, folks. That said, let me show you, speaking of which, the trailer I did of the special feature on my investigations in the U.S.-Mexico border, because it's not just drugs, it's not just guns. The government is also trafficking in humans. One of the largest human trafficking operations probably the world has ever seen, being financed by the U.S. State Department, your own tax dollars, being funneled through the United Nations International Organization for Migration, and being passed along in turn both to migrants, giving them $40,000 interest-free travel loans, which they can't trace them in the country, and so who knows where that money's going, and also to NGOs, which are trafficking them all throughout the United States. Folks, this blows apart the different narratives they've made when it comes to illegal immigration and their actions to try to stem the flow. It's a bunch of nonsense. They're lying to you, and I will show you how they're lying to you. Let me show you a trailer of this, folks, and we'll jump over to EpochTV. What use is a wall if the migrant crisis is being facilitated by the United Nations working with NGOs?
Many of the people that can't get visas to come start off in Mexico, they start in South America.
Is this a coordinated effort? And if so, what's the motive?
Families coming across claiming asylum because they had children, but there was the same children every week. They started testing DNA to make sure that the children were in fact children of the parents. 30% weren't.
What's really happening at the U.S.-Mexico border?
These are all human smuggling cases from the past couple of weeks.
What caused the U.S. policy shift for mass immigration? Yeah, folks, check that out again. That's on EpochTV. That was my investigation of the U.S.-Mexico border. And it has a lot of information in there that just blows apart the narratives. I really hope that they can get more traction on it, because I think that video can change the entire discussion that we're having on illegal immigration. Not to mention the fact, folks, your tax money is going and funding it. That's your tax dollars. The money that, as they're causing mass unemployment in the United States and they're bringing in 5 million people who need jobs, more competition for it. You're already facing problems, buying gas. You're already facing problems with rising rents. Supply and demand. What happens if you move 5 million people into a country? Well, prices go up. You can no longer afford houses. That's what happens. Not only are they doing that to you, but they're making you pay for it. This video could change the narrative, so be sure to check it out, folks. Again, it's called The Border Deception. It's on EpochTV. Folks, let's jump over to EpochTV exclusively now. I'll see you there. Folks, thank you so much for being here. Those of you curious also, I have the classic tea today. It's a ginseng tea.